I am here. My name is Peter Anthony Gales with Francis Wade of Framework Consulting. And Francis is a consultant and a thought leader around business practices within the Caribbean. Francis has done a podcast about the plantation culture, and that's the subject of today's interview. Francis, welcome.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I am well. Francis, for our listeners and our viewers, could you say a little bit about what the plantation culture is?
Yeah, let me summarize it by saying this: that we in the Caribbean have a very unique work culture. In that our work culture, by and large, is inherited from the plantation slavery that happened here in our region from the 1500s to the early 1800s. So before the current residents of our region and our ancestors came here, there were only Arawaks, Caribs, and other Native American Indians. They were eventually killed off after a couple hundred years, and our ancestors were brought here to work. And they were brought here to work either as owners or overseers of plantations, brought here as slaves to work on plantations, or brought here as indentured servants or indentured workers, which replaced the slaves starting from the early 1800s. So we all have one thing in common when it comes to work, that all of our ancestors came here to work on plantations. And the predominant work ethic that you can find in our companies is one of the plantation, with all of the warts and all.
Very interesting. In fact, I was thinking about the whole idea of why large groups of people that, let's say, I know, don't like to work. The idea of work is work is a four-letter word, and this is a great explanation of it. Because if the cultural conversation that you grew up in is based on a time when work was actually dangerous, unpleasant, there were really serious consequences to it, and it was something that you had to do, then it's not surprising that your view on work is not a positive one.
Yeah, and I'd add in a dimension there, in that work that is dangerous, nasty, that you feel like you have to do isn't inherently a bad thing, because we probably all have work that we've done that's been that way. The difference is that what made it dangerous, awful, and a horrible experience that it was that it involved enslavement or quasi enslavement. So something in the relationship between the worker and the manager is what made it as bad as it was. But it wasn't the work itself, because as difficult as plantation work was, there is much more difficult work than that.
Yeah. So where can someone listen to your podcast, Francis?
You can hear it at http://fwconsulting.podomatic.com.
All right. So tell me now. So we now have an idea of what the plantation culture is, and anyone who has lived and worked in the Caribbean will recognize this. And now, instead of saying or just making an observation and coming to a conclusion, perhaps that these people in the Caribbean just don't make good workers, if that's what someone would say, at least they can now understand where it comes from. And of course, we generalize. We're not saying that everyone in the Caribbean doesn't like to work. You and I are definitely exceptions to that generalization. Because I know you love to work and I love to work. There's no retiring happening here. What would you say, and what are you saying to businesses in Jamaica about how to deal with the plantation culture?
Well, the first step is to accept that it exists. Unfortunately, we don't have open conversations in companies about where people learn to work. And this is, by the way, it's not about working for yourself, because we have no problem with that. It's not about working in a volunteer capacity, because many people across the region work in their church or in their community. It's not even about working towards goals, because as we just saw in Berlin, Caribbean work runners just there were only 2 non-Caribbean runners in the final of the women's 100 meters. So it's not about work per se, but it's about working for someone else. And that dynamic, it's actually a relationship, particular kind of relationship, is one that's never discussed in companies. So what a smart company could do is talk about the fact that if they're not careful, they would go to the default relationship between manager and worker, which happens to come from the plantation model, a plantation relationship. And in Jamaica, we have a phrase called slaving up somebody.
Slaving?
Slaving up.
Slaving up, yeah.
And it's a complaint by a worker that management is treating them as if they were a slave. Now, we still talk in those terms.
Yes.
And you still expect the worst manager to behave as if you are their slave, even though you're not. So that sort of anticipation is already there before the first day of work has started. So to talk about it, and the fact that it's there, and the fact that it's inescapable, it's a part of our history, and that it's a default way that we relate to each other, is the first step.
Well, once they do that, okay, so you accept it. You understand where it's coming from, so that allows for a certain degree of compassion for the situation, which is essential. Now that you know that, what else, what sort of practical steps could you... Well, actually, let me ask you a more fundamental question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to, in a particular workplace, and then I'm going to ask you the same question for let's say the entire country of Jamaica, to actually transform that culture? Or if not, is it such that if the answer is no, or that it takes too long, is the answer more to deal with the situation, handle it so that you can get the best out of the situation, and you just have to deal or accept that that's how it is and it's going to stay that way? Where do you land in that discussion?
Let's say that there's both. I would adopt both approaches. In the first case, I would look for a personal transformation where someone takes responsibility for something that they've never been responsible for up until that point. So a worker would take responsibility for relating to their manager as if they're going to oppress them, or as if they're trying to take something away.
So there's a certain amount of recognition or responsibility on the part of the worker.
Right. Manager would do the same from their point of view. Where am I treating the worker as if they're lazy, shiftless, and good for nothing? All of which is language that came from slavery days. And if they can get to the point where they can both recognize I wouldn't call them practices, but let's call them bad habits. The bad habits that engender that kind of relationship. Then if I catch myself acting out in one of those two roles in perhaps many different ways that I could distinguish for myself, I could know when I'm being the slave master just by how I'm thinking and just by how I'm speaking to someone else. So if I can catch myself in the middle of the behavior, then I have a chance. So I've taken responsibility. I catch myself in the middle of the behavior. And then what the company can do to sort of make the worst of a bad situation is to provide, I've seen some companies have ombuds people. Some of them have coaches. Some of them have mentors, but people that you can go to in a safe environment to discuss what's happening with you, a manager or worker, with respect to what you're seeing happening in your relationship with the other parties.